The decision of the Western Cape High Court to dismiss the corruption case brought by the National Prosecuting Authority against the former State Security Minister Bongani Bongo has once again turned a sharp focus on the ANC step-aside resolution. To give us more clarity and more detail, we're joined by political analyst Sanusha Naidu. Sanusha, very good morning to you. Thank you for your time. Now, the step-aside matter has become a really thorny problem for the ANC, a matter that's become essentially a battleground for factions vying for power in the ruling party. When it comes specifically to Bongani Bongo, his matter was thrown out of court. Where then would the step-aside resolution have placed him in this matter, considering what happened in court, had it been implemented?
Good morning, Paul. And I think you definitely highlight a dilemma for the party, particularly for the NEC and the president, particularly around the lines of asking members of the party to step aside because they feel that there's an allegation or a criminal proceeding hanging over their head. And so they're asking them to step aside until all legal issues have been dealt with. And in the case of Mr. Bongo, I think that what you have is a litmus test for this step-aside principle and resolution that the party has to grapple with. Because if I think about the way the resolution or the way the step-aside principle has been articulated, it has been articulated in the sense that the person may step aside because there's a legal issue hanging over their head, or they're implicated allegedly in a legal issue, there's a criminal proceeding, and therefore let the due process of the law and the judiciary take its course. Now, in this case, I think the court, as it ruled on Friday, it basically dismissed the case against Mr. Bongo based on what they found was maybe perhaps insufficient evidence, or the terms of reference of the case did not necessarily warrant that the bribery charges be instituted against him. So this now then throws it back to the ANC, to the party, in terms of its legal dimension. If I remember correctly as well, even in the case of Mr. Ace Magashule, he's waiting for the resolution principles to be finalized around this principle of step aside. So again, we're seeing this disconnect between what is the internal dynamics of the party, the legal opinion, and we've had about 3 legal opinions within the party around some of these issues, and there still seems to be uncertainty around it from a legal perspective. And then, of course, the natural kind of a letter of the law, the judiciary process, where we now have a precedent in terms of what will the ANC do? Go back to the drawing board, look at the principle again, look at all of the legal opinion, apply it, decide how it will go forward. But for now, I think Mr. Bongo's case represents something that the ANC has to go back and start mulling over in terms of how this principle applies in terms of implementation, especially where a person now has been found that the case against them does not stand.
And what then is troublesome or perhaps worrisome about the step-aside resolution? I mean, some MPs have said that while it's politically correct on paper, it is constitutionally flawed and going against, perhaps, in conflict with the laws of the country's constitution.
Yeah, so there's 2 dimensions here. One is, what does it mean for the ANC's constitution, and how that applies in the context of the comments and the remarks made by certain members of parliament and others around the constitutionality of the principle. And I think in the context of the ANC's own constitution, there may be certain murky grey areas around this. When it comes to the constitution of the country, the republic, I think, in terms of this again, I would say that in the context of the separation of powers, you let the judiciary run its course. You have the whole judicial process take effect. You've seen this. Some people may not like the decision, but of course the question is the judiciary is applying the way it interprets the statutes and the case proceeding with regard to how the issue has been dealt with and whether there is a case to be made for this process. So I think at the end of the day, there are different dynamics around this in terms of what's happening within the constitution of the ANC versus the constitution of the republic. And I think if you're going to apply the constitution of the republic, then you have to follow it in the context of what is precedent, what is the judicial outcome, and how that judicial outcome then is applied. There is also the question around whether the MPA would seek to continue this matter with maybe going further and deepening their investigation and finding that they can have new information, new charge sheets leveled against Mr. Bongo. Right now, I think that's where the MPA sits. So I think the process in itself has to be looked at in terms of where the political dynamics lie and where the legal dynamics lie. And of course, there's this gray area in between. So obviously, at the end of the day, it's going to be quite fascinating to actually look at those troublesome areas, or what you may call the area of uncertainty with regard to the constitutionality, because in many ways, if the Constitution of the Republic is sacrosanct and it is the highest law of the land, you've got to respect the outcome in terms of how that Constitution is applied. And then, of course, you've got to also think about the judiciary and its ruling and how you respect that as well.
As you make mention, Sanusha, of the NPA, many have lambasted the NPA and the Hawks for making arrests without having enough evidence to convict a person. In this case, the Bongani Bongo. Where does this now put, Bongani, perhaps the NPA, when it comes to questions of credibility and independence? Essentially, the matter was Bongo being accused of trying to collapse an inquiry in Eskom in 2017 by offering a bribe to evidence leader and, of course, walking away free. It brings us now our focus on the NPA itself.
Yeah, I think the MPA, the Hawks, have continuously battled this PR reputational risk. At times they get it right, at times they don't get it right. I think it also talks to the previous question you raised around the political dynamics. Is it informed by just political outcomes, political dynamics, political dynamics that are basically shaping what is the intention of some of these arrests? Or is it really around the nature of the fact that there's been sufficient evidence, there's been sufficient investigation, the information is there, and it can actually proceed with its case in terms of the arrests it's make? And I think that's a big question for us in terms of where we see this going as we move forward. I think it also kind of fuels the perceptions that people like former President Jacob Zuma has about the credibility, the PR, the reputation, the authenticity of the MPA in the mandate and the execution of its duties in terms of in the criminal justice system. It also makes one wonder again, to what extent the MPA can be apolitical, if that's a possibility in any country, around the way it applies its mandate and the way it applies its duties. So obviously, for factions in the ANC who have been basically against this kind of step-aside principle, will look to this Bongo case and say, listen, here we see that this was, in some cases, they'll claim a political witch hunt. It was part of the political game. It was part of the political battlegrounds that have been drawn in the ANC. So I think at the end of the day, for me, what will be critical is if the MPA is going to court and there are big cases on its ticket, there are big cases that are coming up, that it has to make sure that it does all of its due diligence. It's able to have the evidence and support that evidence with relevant information, documentation, and try and be a little bit more about the letter of the law and try and remain apolitical, which again is very difficult to do at times.
Very well. Thank you so much for your time.